My father thanked 73 people before someone in the audience finally asked, "What about Lena?" He smiled, lifted his glass, and said, "She was never really part of the work." That was the sentence that broke the banquet. Not loudly, not all at once, but completely. The Hillcrest Country Club ballroom had been staged for respect. White linen, silver water pitchers, deep blue drapery behind the podium, a slideshow looping through 32 years of county infrastructure work. Ribbon cuttings, road openings, flood control briefings, handshakes near construction sites, ceremonial shovels in wet dirt. Every photograph told the same story. Here is a man who built things that lasted. Here's a career that mattered. Here is a legacy the county should honor. My father loved rooms like that because rooms like that make history look clean. They remove the late-night corrections, the hidden panic, the borrowed intelligence, the inconvenient people who kept the structure standing while someone else learned how to speak beside it. He stood at the podium in a dark charcoal suit, silver tie, county seal pin on his lapel. He looked composed, practiced, public. He had the face of a man who expected the evening to close exactly where he wanted it to close, with applause, clean memory, and no questions large enough to damage the version of himself he intended to leave behind. My mother sat in the front row beside my brother Daniel. Of course Daniel was there. Daniel had spent most of his adult life in the orbit of my father's authority, and all the reflected light that came with it. He was not stupid. He was worse than stupid. He was plausible. Tall, good in work boots, easy with contractors, strong handshake, strong profile, strong resemblance. Men like my father love sons like my brother, because resemblance can pass for legacy in the right room. I was at table 11 near the sidewall. Not hidden. Placed. That distinction matters. My father never liked obvious cruelty. My mother liked it even less. They both preferred social arrangements that could be defended later with words like practical, unfortunate, and you know how seating works at these things. I was close enough to be seen if someone needed me, far enough away to be excluded from the official frame. That had been my position in the family for years. When my father began his speech, he was at his best, warm enough to sound modest, polished enough to stay in control. He thanked the commissioner, the board, his department heads, the road crews, old contractors, and the young people who passed through the office over the years, and gave us all hope that competence still matters. People laughed. They applauded. He thanked my mother for holding the family steady while public work demanded more than it should. He thanked Daniel by name. He called him a man with the right instincts for the field. That line got more applause than it deserved. Then he moved toward his ending. That was when a woman from the second row, someone from the State Transportation Review team, called out with a smile, "You'd better mention Lena after Millbrook." A few heads turned toward me. My father did not pause. That was the part I remember most clearly. He did not hesitate. He did not search for a gentler answer. He did not buy time. He smiled into the microphone and said, "She was never really part of the work." A few people shifted in their seats. The room did not fully understand yet. So he added, lightly, almost playfully, "She did some contract support around that period, but people tend to romanticize who mattered in the final picture." That was the line that exposed him. Not because it was loud, because it was deliberate. He had taken years of my work, flattened it into contract support, and then turned any correction into sentimentality. In one sentence, he erased my technical role and insulted the truth that might restore it. My mother looked down at her glass. Daniel stared at his plate. No one at the front table moved. That is how public betrayal works in respectable rooms. It arrives inside manners. Then a chair scraped across the floor at table 3. Marcus Hale stood up. Marcus Hale was president of Hale Infrastructure Consulting, the county's largest outside contractor on the Millbrook package. He was supposed to speak later during the slideshow tribute. He was not supposed to interrupt. He was not supposed to turn a retirement banquet into a factual problem. He stepped into the aisle with a leather folio in one hand and said, "Then I need to correct the record before this room claps for the wrong version." Now the room changed. Not because he was emotional, because he was credible. He looked at my father and said, "If Lena Mercer was never part of the work, then someone needs to explain whose calculations kept Millbrook from failing review." That was the point of no return. Every eye in the ballroom moved. Not to my father. To me. To Marcus. To the word Millbrook hanging in the air like a steel beam suddenly unsupported. My father's retirement banquet had stopped being a celebration. It had become a hearing. And the worst part for him was not that I was in the room. It was that the file was too. But to understand why that one line hit so hard, you need to understand the lie beneath it, the one my father, my mother, and my brother had been living inside for years. Because the banquet did not invent the betrayal. It only exposed the final version of it. The hidden truth at my father's retirement banquet was not emotional. That is exactly why it was so dangerous. Emotional truths can be softened, reframed, delayed, folded into family language. But technical truths, once documented properly, are much harder to kill. The truth was this: 5 years earlier, the Millbrook Bridge redesign was one review cycle away from becoming a county disaster, and I was the engineer who stopped that from happening. Not my father. Not my brother. Me. Millbrook was not just another county bridge. It was a flagship project, a regional connector between the Eastern Freight Corridor and the Interstate Feeder Line, funded through a layered mix of county appropriations, state transportation support, and private logistics investment. It was the kind of project politicians point at when they want to sound serious about growth and safety at the same time. It was also the project my father intended to retire on. That mattered. Because men like him do not simply work on infrastructure, they curate legacy through it. The first design package looked stable until revised freight projections and updated material assumptions exposed a weakness in the load transfer sequence across one of the transitional spans. The private contractor saw warning signs. Internal reviewers saw delays. But inside the county office, no one wanted the truth early enough for it to be useful. My father especially. He did not panic publicly. He never did. He panicked by narrowing the circle and calling the person he trusted most when the problem had to be solved without changing the social order around it. That person was me. He called on a Thursday night and told me he needed a quick look. A quick look turned into 14 hours of recalculation. I spread the drawing sets across my dining table, ran the revised loading assumptions, checked the transfer path, then checked it again because I could not believe they had allowed the package to advance that far without catching the vulnerability. By midnight, I knew two things. The project could not pass intact, and my father already suspected that. He had not called me for reassurance. He had called me because he needed rescue without exposure. I told him the package had to be corrected before state review. He asked, "Can you fix it quietly? That sentence contains my entire family." Not. "Can you help us do this honestly?" Not. "Can you step in and be credited?" Not. "Can you save the project?" Quietly. I rebuilt the transfer path, documented the revised assumptions, and wrote the correction memo in a format clear enough that no competent reviewer could miss the issue once the packet moved. Then I sent it to my father privately at his request, because he wanted time to manage how the correction entered the chain. Manage. Another family word for truth under sedation. A week later, he asked me to come on a temporary external contract to formalize the redesign support. He said the county needed clean process. What he meant was simple. He needed my technical authority without giving me narrative authority. I accepted. That was my mistake. Not because I was wrong about the work. Because I still believed there might be a version of the story where my father would eventually say, publicly and plainly, "My daughter saved the redesign." He never did. The corrected package moved. The state review accepted it. The private contractor stayed in. The public messaging described the project as an example of county leadership adapting successfully under pressure. That leadership was credited to my father. Then, gradually, to Daniel. Daniel's name started appearing beside the project at briefings, site visits, and county summaries as technical liaison and field-facing coordination support. He did not build the correction. He inherited the atmosphere around it. That distinction is at the heart of everything. My father always trusted my work more in private. He trusted Daniel's face more in public. That was the hidden structure. And because public life remembers faces faster than memos, my work began disappearing inside my brother's emerging reputation. The project archive reflected that. The public display reflected that. The banquet booklet reflected that. By the time the retirement dinner arrived, Millbrook had already been folded into the family myth. Father built, son continued. Daughter was useful at some point in the margins. That was the hidden truth in the room. Not merely that I had helped, that the most celebrated project of my father's final decade depended on technical intervention he later pushed out of public memory because it did not flatter the version of leadership he wanted preserved. This matters because the betrayal was not one sentence at a banquet. The sentence was simply the first time he said the quiet part aloud in front of everyone who mattered. She was never really part of the work. That line only works if the room has already been prepared to believe it. And my family had prepared it for years. My core wound was never a lack of ability. That would have been easier. It was being raised in a family where my strongest abilities became most valuable the moment they could be used without being publicly named. My brother Daniel was the kind of child people describe as naturally confident. He walked into rooms as if they had been expecting him. He had my father's height, my father's easy public grin, and my father's talent for sounding certain before he had fully earned it. People confuse that with leadership all the time. I was different. I liked precision. I trusted paper more than posture. As a child, I corrected math worksheets faster than my teachers could hand them back. As a teenager, I noticed when adults skipped steps in their reasoning. By university, I had already learned something that would shape the rest of my life. People admire visible confidence sooner than they respect invisible correctness. My father knew I was better technically. That is important. He was not blind. He let me sit beside him when I was young while he reviewed county maps, bid summaries, and route estimates. He trusted me with numbers before he trusted Daniel with anything more complicated than a site photo and a handshake. Once, when I was 16 and angry after watching Daniel get praised for taking initiative on a school fundraiser where I had actually done all the budget modeling, my father told me, "You see structures other people miss." At the time, I thought that was praise. Later, I understood it was classification. I was not being raised as the one who would inherit the stage. I was being raised as the one who could keep the structure standing behind it. That difference became brutal as we got older. Daniel was the son people imagined beside my father at county events. I was the daughter people consulted when things became too technical to fake. My mother deepened that divide in subtler ways. She had no real interest in engineering, but she understood status perfectly. She knew which child reflected best in public. Daniel looked like continuity. He could be photographed. He could be introduced. He could fit the family story into one flattering sentence. I complicated it. I asked questions that slowed down easy narratives. I did not smile through vague praise. I did not treat men with job titles like natural authorities if their reasoning was weak. That made me useful and inconvenient at the same time. So my family built a language for me. Lena is the smart one. She's good with details. She likes the back-end work. She doesn't need attention. Each sentence sounded harmless. Together, they were a cage. The most damaging one was the last. She doesn't need attention. That phrase did years of work inside my life. It allowed my father to trust me privately and omit me publicly. It allowed Daniel to receive atmospheres I had built. It allowed my mother to treat my invisibility as proof of character instead of evidence of theft. If you hear a phrase like that long enough, you start participating in your own reduction. You call your work support. You say you only helped. You let yourself be folded into teams and categories that get smaller every time someone else needs the room to belong to them. That was my deepest flaw. Not insecurity. Moral mislabeling. I had mistaken self-erasure for professionalism. That is why Millbrook mattered so much. Not only because it was a major project, because it activated the oldest pattern in my life. My father called when the structure was in danger. I fixed it. He contained the truth. Daniel inherited the surface. And because some buried part of me still wanted what daughters like me always want from fathers like him, public, uncomplicated recognition, I kept accepting terms that guaranteed I would never receive it. That is why the banquet cut so deep. The sentence itself was cruel, yes. But cruelty alone is not what makes a story expensive. What made it expensive was that my father had finally said, in a room full of people, the one thing his behavior had been teaching me all along. My work counted most when it remained detachable from my name. She was never really part of the work. He did not mean I lacked ability. He meant I did not belong inside the final public version. That was the wound. And once a woman understands that she has been useful inside a story that was never meant to name her, she has only two options. Keep saving the structure and disappear inside it. Or let the structure crack loudly enough that everyone sees whose weight it was resting on. The banquet forced that choice. And by then, I was too old, too tired, and too exact to keep calling disappearance a virtue. My father was not a dramatic villain. That made him more effective. He had built his career, and his authority at home. Not through obvious cruelty, but through controlled legitimacy. He understood process just well enough to command it, language just well enough to soften it, and people just well enough to keep them arranged around his version of events. He was never the smartest engineer in the room. He was the man most practiced at making the room feel as though it did not need one. That was his power. In county life, that kind of man goes very far. He knew how to thank enough people that no one noticed who had not been named. He knew how to speak in broad public terms that made specifics feel rude. He knew how to move responsibility upward when things succeeded and downward when things became technical, difficult, or embarrassing. My mother supported that power by controlling social interpretation. If my father managed institutions, she managed atmosphere. She knew how to introduce Daniel in ways that made him sound inevitable. She knew how to describe me in ways that sounded flattering but reduced my scale. She knew how to make almost any correction seem like poor timing, poor tone, or poor manners. She never needed to lie directly. She only needed to tilt the room. Daniel completed the structure in the easiest way possible. He was the beneficiary. That role is often underrated in family drama because it looks passive from the outside. It is not. Beneficiaries learn quickly when a room is prepared to hand them more than they earned, and unless they refuse it, they become part of the machinery. Daniel rarely corrected praise. He rarely clarified scope. He never stood up and said Lena did that part. He let admiration gather. That was enough. So, by the time Millbrook entered public memory, the three of them already occupied the perfect architecture for theft. My father held official authority. My mother shaped public family language. Daniel stood where succession looked natural. And I? I was the one called after hours when the numbers broke. That is the true antagonist structure of this story. Not one cruel father. A full family system that knew exactly where my value belonged and exactly how to keep it from becoming public capital. That is why the retirement banquet was such a dangerous room for them. Because rooms like that are designed to convert social arrangement into history. The front tables. The tribute board. The family legacy section in the booklet. The speech order. The applause lines. The son seated beside the father. It was all one diagram. And my father believed, as men like him often do, that if he shaped the evening correctly enough, the archive would obey. He underestimated one thing. Paper survives charisma. And once the file entered the room, his power had to compete with something he could not emotionally arrange. That is what made the antagonist structure finally vulnerable. Not because it became less cruel. Because it became measurable. The banquet mattered because it formalized a pattern that had been wounding me for years. No great family betrayal begins at the climax. It begins in small, deniable moments. That is what makes them so hard to challenge early, and so obvious once the whole structure is visible. One of the first moments I should have understood more clearly came after a county design award about 8 years before the banquet. A flood control redesign I had quietly corrected under consultant review won regional recognition. My father accepted the plaque. Daniel was invited to the stage as part of the next generation of infrastructure leadership. I was in the audience with a folded program in my lap, and my own red-line notes still sitting on my desk at home. After the ceremony, someone congratulated Daniel for being around all the big projects already. He smiled and said, "Not a lie. Worse. A sentence broad enough to keep the room wrong." Then there was the Millbrook archive binder in my father's home office. The spine label read, Millbrook Field, Final. Inside were my recalculations, my markup sheets, my revised transfer memo. But the front summary sheet, typed neatly and inserted under clear plastic, listed Project Lead, Edward Mercer. Field Liaison. No external review attribution. I saw that binder at least 6 times before the banquet. I never said anything. That silence cost me more than I knew at the time. Another wound came in the county newsletter. After Millbrook passed review, Communications published a piece titled, Leadership Under Pressure. How the Mercer team held the line. The featured photo showed my father and Daniel on site in reflective vests, looking into the middle distance as if both of them had personally carried the bridge into structural safety. I was mentioned once near the bottom. Outside technical support contributed to the revised package. Outside technical support. That was me. Years of training. My license. My intervention. My risk. Reduced to a phrase generic enough to mean almost anyone with a laptop and a stamp. When I challenged my father, he said, "Communications always simplifies." Simplifies. Notice how all the family language moved one direction. My actual role got smaller. Their visible ownership got larger. Then came the planning atrium display 6 months before the banquet. The county planning office mounted large retrospective boards for major infrastructure projects. Millbrook had its own section with renderings, revised timelines, and a caption block labeled, Key Internal Leadership. My father's name. Daniel's name. Not mine. I stood there in that atrium with county staff walking past, pretending not to stare too long, and felt something inside me go terribly still. Because a display board is not a conversation. It is memory prepared in public. My mother found me there and said, in the bright social tone she used whenever she wanted my anger to look embarrassing, "It isn't healthy to get hung up on credit." That sentence did more damage than she knew. Because families like mine treat credit as ego precisely so they can keep stealing record. Credit is not vanity. Credit is historical location. If your name is not attached to the work, one day someone will say you were never really part of it. And by then, everyone will have a board, a booklet, and a dozen old speeches to point at. Then came the banquet booklet itself. The Family Legacy of Public Service section described Daniel as a natural extension of Edward Mercer's practical leadership, with first-hand involvement in key adaptive county projects, including Millbrook. That sentence was a weapon, not because it blatantly called Daniel the engineer, because it made him the inheritor of the project's meaning. And that is the most painful kind of theft, not when someone claims your work directly, but when they absorb the future value of having stood near it. By the time the banquet started, all those small injuries were already inside me. The award stage years earlier, the archive binder, the newsletter line, the planning display, the booklet wording, the constant family dialect of detail, support, help, and not everything has to be so exact. So when my father said, she was never really part of the work, it did not feel like one sentence. It felt like the whole trail of theft compressed into a single public verdict. That is what makes a climax land. Not surprise. I had heard that sentence in fragments for years. At the banquet, he simply removed the fragments and said the shape of the thing out loud. And once he did that in front of contractors, county staff, and state review people, he left no room for the lie to remain soft. That was his mistake. He stopped implying. He declared. And declarations are much easier to kill with paper. The banquet became unavoidable the day the tribute packet arrived. It came in a thick cream envelope embossed with the county seal. Inside was the invitation, a parking pass, a reply card, and a draft program booklet for family review and historical accuracy. Historical accuracy. Even now, that phrase makes me laugh. Because if there was one thing the booklet had no intention of preserving, it was accuracy. Page 9 stopped me. There was a section titled, A Family Legacy of Public Service. Under it, a paragraph on my father's career, then a sidebar. The next generation. Daniel's photo. Daniel's bio. Daniel, described as deeply involved in adaptive county projects, including Millbrook. No mention of me. No mention of external review. No mention of the redesign memo. No mention of the licensed engineer who corrected the structural issue that nearly cost the county the project. I read the line 3 times. Then I called my father. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Why is Daniel described as part of Millbrook's core project history?" He did not even try the truth. He said, "It's a family piece." A family piece. That phrase told me immediately that he had already decided the category of the lie mattered more than the content. I asked, "Does the county plan to preserve that booklet in the retirement archive?" He said, "Probably." I asked, "Then why am I not named anywhere in the project history?" He sighed, not guilty. Irritated. "Lena," he said, "this is not the time to relitigate technical contribution." Relitigate. That word settled everything. Because truth only becomes relitigation when the false version has already been allowed to harden long enough to feel convenient. I said, "I corrected the redesign." He answered, "You supported the redesign." Support. There it was again. That family word they always gave me when what they really meant was, "You held the thing up while someone else stood in front of it." Then he said the line that made the banquet impossible to ignore. Not every part of the work belongs in the final picture. That was the real inciting incident. Not the booklet. That sentence, because it named the rule I had been living under for years. My labor could be essential without being visible. I hung up, opened the archive folder on my laptop, and pulled everything. My original load memo. The revised transfer sequence, the timestamped emails, the contract invoice, my stamped review notes, the corrected bid packet, the private message from my father. Need you to look at this urgently. Keep the circle tight until we know how to handle it. Then at 11:07 that night, Marcus Hale texted me. Did you see the banquet booklet? I answered. Yes. He replied, it's wrong. That message mattered more than he knew, because it moved the issue outside the family structure. No longer my memory. No longer my hurt. No longer my father's version. Against my silence. A contractor. A witness. A man with the packet. A man with no emotional reason to exaggerate in my favor. We spoke the next morning. Marcus was direct. He said if the banquet turned Millbrook into a father-son legacy story, he was unwilling to sit in the room and let that go unchallenged if it became explicit. He said the file was clean. He said the review sequence was obvious to anyone competent enough to read it. He said, if he says the wrong thing, I will correct it. That was all I needed. I did not ask him to cause a scene. I did not ask him to defend me. I did not ask him for revenge. I asked one thing. Bring the packet. He said yes. At that point, the banquet was no longer a sentimental family event. It was a room waiting for collision. My father still believed he could close his career the way he wanted. My mother still believed atmosphere would outrun record. Daniel still believed he could inherit the clean version. What none of them understood was that the very thing they had always counted on, my discipline, had changed sides. I was no longer using it to protect the room. I was using it to prepare the truth. The Hillcrest ballroom became dangerous the moment dessert was served. Not because anything had happened yet, because by then the room had been fully arranged. That is what a real pressure chamber is in a story like this, a room where the lie has every possible advantage before the truth arrives. My father had the podium. My mother had the front row. Daniel had the future-facing seat beside him. The county commissioner had already praised a family legacy of public service. The slideshow had already linked Millbrook to the Mercer name. The printed booklet had already done its work. Every person whose memory mattered had been seated, softened, and subtly instructed on how to interpret the family before the main speech even began. That was my mother's part of the machine. She spent the first hour of the evening moving through the room like a private campaign manager wrapped in pearls. She touched shoulders. She smiled in low light. She repeated the same phrases with just enough variation to make them sound spontaneous. Daniel has really grown into that work. Edward always said continuity matters. It means so much to see a son carry practical values forward. Millbrook taught all of us what this family is made of. That last sentence landed everywhere. Because it took a bridge I had rescued and converted it into bloodline mythology. My mother always did her best work before the microphone turned on. My father, meanwhile, worked the room the way experienced public men do when they know they are being honored. He made sure every table got one personal line. He remembered names, recent promotions, sick relatives, old weather events tied to county projects. He was skilled enough at public intimacy that people mistook his memory for sincerity. Daniel stayed close, but not too close. That was important too. He knew how to look like the son who never asked for inheritance while standing exactly where inheritance would find him. That is what made him so useful to my father. He did not need to claim the legacy. He only needed to seem ready to receive it. I stayed where I had been seated. Table 11, side wall, visible but structurally irrelevant. My father had always preferred me in that position. In private, my exactness had value. In public, it was safest if I looked like a thoughtful guest, a competent daughter, maybe even a former helper, never the person whose name could destabilize the architecture of the room. Marcus Hale arrived early enough to see the tribute boards, but late enough not to get pulled into my mother's social orbit. That was one of the many reasons I trusted him professionally. He had no taste for decorative conversation when facts were nearby. He came to my table once, just briefly, with his water glass in hand and the leather folio tucked under his arm. Still in there, he said quietly. I knew what he meant. The packet, the Millbrook correction sequence, my signed structural memo, the revised transfer calculations, the chain of emails showing exactly when the redesign became viable. I nodded once. He added, if he keeps it broad, I leave it alone. That was fair. I did not want spectacle either. Marcus was not there to rescue me emotionally. He was there because he knew something I had learned too late in family life and very early in engineering. If a structure is already carrying a false load, you do not strike it for sport. You intervene only when the stress path becomes dangerous enough that collapse is already underway. The room had not reached that point yet. Then the MC returned to the podium. He was a local news anchor with exactly the right kind of voice for events like this, smooth enough to make sentiment sound dignified, practiced enough to keep the evening moving, even when the content got soft around the edges. He introduced the final segment as a celebration of work, legacy, and the people who keep county standing when no one is looking. That line irritated me more than it should have, because it was true. And the room had already been arranged to award that truth to the wrong people. The lights dimmed further. The slideshow shifted to the last sequence. Edward Mercer through the years. County roads behind him, county crews around him, Daniel appearing more and more often near the end, like a shadow being promoted into lineage. People grew quieter. That was the moment the pressure sealed. No one wanted interruption now. No one wanted complexity. The room wanted completion. And completion is where lies become most vulnerable, because people stop checking the weight once the structure looks finished. That is why pressure chambers matter in drama. The lie must be allowed to become elegant before the truth enters. Otherwise, the reveal feels like argument. Once the lie becomes beautiful, the truth feels like cost. And this room had made my father's lie beautiful. A father retiring with honor. A son rising naturally. A daughter somewhere in the audience who had done some contract work and should know better than to disturb the final frame. If my father had stayed broad, Marcus would have stayed seated. If my father had thanked me vaguely, the room would have moved on. If he had simply left me out, the night would still have hurt, but it would not have broken. That was his fatal flaw. He never understood where performance had to stop. He always believed the room would carry him farther than it should. The pressure chamber did not explode because of a mistake. It exploded because he decided, in the most protected moment of the evening, to say the one sentence that turned omission into denial. And once he did that in front of the contractor who held the packet, the room stopped being his. It became the truth's. My father began well. That mattered. If he had sounded clumsy or defensive too early, the room would have braced itself. But he did what experienced public men do at retirement banquets. He made people feel grateful before he made them feel sentimental. He thanked the commissioner. He thanked the county board. He thanked the crews who did the hard work before the public ever saw the result. That line was clever. It signaled humility, while still keeping himself at the emotional center. Then he thanked planning staff, procurement, contractors, and the young engineers who came through the office over the years. Again, clever. Broad enough to sound generous. Vague enough to reveal nothing. The room relaxed. People laughed at the right places. They nodded at the familiar stories. My mother smiled every time he used words like service, steadiness, and continuity. Daniel sat with his shoulders square and chin slightly lowered, wearing the expression of a son trying not to seem too ready for praise already moving toward him. Then my father reached the part of the speech he had been waiting for all night. The family section. He spoke about my mother first, naturally. He called her the person who held the house steady when public work spilled past office walls. That got a warm wave of applause. Then he turned toward Daniel. And to my son, he said, thank you for caring enough about the work to understand what it costs. That line landed exactly where my father wanted it to. Not the work itself, its cost. It made Daniel sound not just involved, but initiated. Like he had inherited not the projects, but the burden of them. That is how lineage is built in public rooms. Not through specific claims, through emotional framing. The applause for Daniel lasted longer than it should have. My father let it. Then, instead of ending cleanly, he grew ambitious. That was the mistake. Because successful liars rarely stop at enough. They push one step too far, usually because the room starts agreeing with them, and agreement feels like permission. A woman from the second row, bright, casual, smiling, unaware she was about to tear open the evening, called out, "You'd better mention Lena after Millbrook. It could still have been saved." That is the painful part. There was still a graceful path available. He could have said yes. Lena came in at a critical point. He could have nodded toward me. He could have folded me into the history without losing his own centrality. But my father did not want accuracy. He wanted closure. And he had spent too many years relying on my restraint to imagine the sentence could cost him. So he smiled and said, "She was never really part of the work." The line hit harder the second time than it had in memory. Because once spoken into a microphone, cruelty acquires architecture. He was not done. He went further. She did some contract support during that season, but people tend to romanticize who mattered in the final picture. That was the peak. Not just erasure. Correction-proof erasure. He had taken my role, reduced it, and then built a moral frame around anyone who might object. Romanticize? Oversensitive. Misremember. Inflate. In one move, he denied my contribution and preemptively discredited the truth. The room did exactly what respectable rooms do in moments like that. It hesitated. Some people looked uncomfortable. Some looked confused. Some looked at me. Then away. Because public family injury makes strangers feel suddenly complicit and they rarely know what to do with that feeling. My mother did not move. That told me everything. She had expected this. Maybe not the exact sentence, but the shape of it. The deliberate narrowing. The pushing of me out of the final picture. Daniel's jaw tightened. He still said nothing. And that silence made him, in that moment, more clearly an antagonist than he had ever seemed to me before. Because a beneficiary who stays quiet during public theft is not passive. He is cooperating. Then Marcus Hale stood. He did not ask permission. He did not soften the room first. He did not gesture vaguely toward fairness. He stepped into the aisle and said, "Then I need to correct the record before this room applauds the wrong version." That line did two things at once. It took the issue out of family feeling, and it warned the room that applause itself had become consequential. My father laughed lightly, a bad instinct, the kind men reach for when they believe charm can still flatten risk. "Marcus," he said, "I think we both know large projects are more complicated than that." Marcus answered immediately. "No," he said, "this part isn't." Then he held up the folio and delivered the line that ended the speech as my father had imagined it. If Lena Mercer was never part of the work, then someone needs to explain whose calculations kept Millbrook from failing review. Now the room was no longer hesitant. Now it was listening. And once a room listens to a file more than a father, the lie has already peaked and begun to fall. Truth entered that ballroom on paper before it entered through me. That was exactly as it should have been. For too many years, my father had depended on the fact that if I spoke first, he could frame the problem as family tension. If my mother spoke first, she could frame it as bad timing. If Daniel spoke first, he could disappear into confusion. But paper has no tone problem. Marcus opened the folio and walked toward the stage. The county commissioner stood halfway, uncertain for 1 second whether to intervene, then remained still. That hesitation mattered, because it showed the room what kind of moment this had become. Not disruption to be managed, but information too costly to stop in public. Marcus handed one copy to the commissioner, one to the planning director, and one to the AV technician. No theatrics. No accusations. Just distribution. Then the first page appeared on the screen behind my father's shoulder. Millbrook Bridge Redesign Supplemental Load Transfer Analysis. Prepared by Lena Mercer, P.E., External Structural Review Consultant. My name? My license. My role. It hit the room harder than any speech could have. Because suddenly the evening had two stories on the same wall. The father at the podium, and the document behind him proving he had lied. The next page showed the corrected transfer calculations. The next showed revision timestamps. Then came the email chain. My father's message. Need you to look at this urgently. Keep the circle tight until we know how to handle it. Then mine. This cannot go forward unchanged. Revised transfer path attached. If state review sees the current package, the bid is exposed. No one spoke. Even the wait staff had stopped moving. Professional rooms have a different kind of silence when the truth arrives. It is not theatrical shock. It is calculation. Everyone is adjusting the story they thought they were in. My father tried one more strategy. Context. This doesn't reflect the full collaborative process, he said. But the word collaborative sounded weak now. Because collaboration was not the issue. Attribution was. Marcus answered calmly, which made it even worse for my father. The collaborative process nearly failed, he said. Lena corrected the structural sequence that kept the redesign viable. Then he looked not at my father, but at the room. That's not a sentimental interpretation. That's the packet. That line mattered because it cut off the defense my family had used all my life. That accuracy from me was somehow emotional excess. Not sentiment. Packet. Not wounded daughter. Licensed engineer. Not family grievance. Project record. At that point, I stood. I had let the file speak first because it needed to strip away all the excuses before my voice entered. I had spent too many years being translated downward by family language to make the mistake of arriving in the room as feeling before fact. But once the packet was on the screen, my silence would have become another kind of concession. So I stepped into the aisle and said, "He asked me to save it quietly." The microphone at the podium picked it up. My father turned toward me sharply. My mother closed her eyes for 1 second. Daniel looked like someone had pulled a support beam out from under his chair. I kept going. I fixed the redesign. He buried the correction. Then he taught the room to remember my brother standing near the bridge instead. That was the first time I had ever said the whole thing in one sentence, where my family could not interrupt it. My father said, "That is not fair," and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because fairness is always the word people reach for after truth has already removed their advantage. Marcus opened the final document in the packet. An invoice. My external consulting invoice to the county for the redesign emergency review. Description of services. Structural recalculation. Corrective sequence revision. Review memo for state compliance response. That was the end. Because now the room had motive, record, and payment trail. The truth was no longer merely spoken. It had entered fully. And once truth enters as document, every person still defending the lie has to reveal what they are really protecting. My mother revealed image. My father revealed control. Daniel revealed comfort. I revealed the one thing they had spent years turning into support language. The core of the work itself. Power reversed the moment the room stopped looking at my father for explanation and started looking at the screen for proof. That sounds small. It is not. Public authority depends less on truth than on where people turn first when meaning becomes unstable. For 32 years, rooms like that had turned to my father. Now they were turning away from him while he was still standing there. The county commissioner stepped up first. Not to defend me emotionally, to protect the county institutionally. "We need the Millbrook record reviewed and corrected," she said. No one hearing that sentence could mistake what had happened. This was no longer a family embarrassment. It was a public archive problem. The planning director asked for the packet. The state review woman in the second row, the same one who had called out my name, stood and said, "I remember the revised sequence coming in fast. I was not told it came through external structural correction." That statement was devastating because it activated a second witness chain. Once one professional memory aligns with paper, others begin surfacing. A former county engineer from Table 4 added, "The redesigned language never matched the timeline as cleanly as we were told." There it was. Not only proof, pattern recognition. That is when my father truly lost the room. He still had the podium, but he no longer had interpretive authority. He tried once more. "Millbrook was larger than any one person," he said. That line would have sounded noble 30 minutes earlier. Now it sounded like dilution, because everyone in that ballroom understood the distinction. Yes, the project was large. Yes, many people were involved. But the decisive correction had a name, a license, and a packet behind it. My mother stood finally and said, "Surely this isn't how we want to remember a lifetime of service." That was her move. Shift the room back to sentiment. Ask everyone to prioritize dignity over truth. Make correction feel cruel. The county commissioner didn't even look at her. "We remember service accurately," she said. That line broke whatever was left of my mother's power in the room. Because my mother's entire strength had always depended on framing atmosphere as moral reality. The commissioner had just replaced atmosphere with record. Daniel stood then. For one stupid, fragile second, I hoped he might finally do something clean. He could have said, "Lena did the redesign work." He could have said, "I should have corrected that years ago." He could have stepped out of the inheritance machine for one sentence. He didn't. He said, "No one was trying to erase Lena." That was the line that made the room turn fully against him. Because after the screen, the booklet, the archive board, the banquet speech, and years of gradual public drift, denial was no longer plausible. A woman from the contractor table said, not quietly enough, "That's exactly what this looks like." That was the payoff turn. Now the room was no longer interpreting. It was judging. My father stepped back from the podium. Just one step, but enough. Enough for the symbolism to change. Enough for the audience to feel the center move. Enough for my mother to understand this evening would not be rescued into family legend by coffee and selective retelling. The MC set down the second page of his prepared notes. Daniel sat. My mother remained standing for half a second too long, then lowered herself into her chair with the stiffness of someone trying to preserve dignity after authority has already gone. The commissioner looked at me and said formally, "Miss Mercer, the county owes you proper attribution." That line was late. Institutional. Incomplete. It still mattered. Because it came in the one register my father had denied me all my life. Public, official, unmistakable. The applause that followed was uneven at first, then stronger. Not affectionate, corrective. That distinction matters. The room was not celebrating me. It was repairing itself. I stepped closer to the podium then, and said the line that closed the emotional argument completely. I was useful when the structure was in danger. I became inconvenient when the story was being written. That was the payoff line. Because it named the whole family system in one sentence. And once that line landed, no one in the room could pretend the issue was merely banquet timing, family tension, or old sensitivity. This was the truth. They had used me in crisis and erased me in legacy. My father looked at me as if I had said something harsher than the documents already had. That, too, was revealing. Men like him can survive facts more easily than moral summary. Because facts live in files. Moral summary lives in memory. And that night, memory changed. Not because my father was destroyed. Because his version was no longer the one anyone would repeat first. That is real power reversal. Not humiliation. Priority. The truth had become the lead story in the room. Aftershock did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as rearrangement. That is always more damaging in respectable rooms. People did not surround my father. They did not cluster around my mother with sympathetic hands. They did not drift back into harmless banquet talk as if the room could absorb what happened and still digest dessert. They repositioned. The commissioner moved toward the planning director and the packet. The state review official went directly to Marcus. The county columnist stopped pretending she was there for a retirement feature and began writing a very different story. 3 contractors left their tables and walked toward the display boards, already reconsidering the project history mounted in the atrium outside. The room had stopped functioning as a celebration. It had become an audit of memory. My mother came to me first. Of course she did. Not to apologize. To recenter pain. "You've humiliated him," she said. That sentence would once have gone straight through me. Not anymore. I looked at her and said, "No." I stopped him from ending his career with a lie. That line mattered because it refused her favorite category. Humiliation was emotional. The lie was factual. I was no longer agreeing to let the emotional cost of exposure outweigh the moral cost of the original theft. She stepped back like I had slapped her. I had not. I had only stopped translating myself into the language she could survive. My father came next. Still no apology. Even then, he said, "This should have been handled privately." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about him after all those years. Even with the file exposed, the commissioner involved, the room changed, and the packet in circulation, he still believed the greatest wrong was not the erasure itself, but the scale of the witness group. I answered, "You made it public when you denied it at the podium." He had no reply. That silence felt more honest than anything he had said all evening. Daniel tried later, near the hallway to the coat check. He looked pale and suddenly younger, which is what happens to men who have built too much identity on inherited narrative and then watch it collapse in public. He said, I asked, "How many times did you let him stop before that?" He opened his mouth and closed it. Good. Because by then I no longer wanted soft, brotherly regret. I wanted him to feel the edge of his own participation. The article the next morning was restrained. That mattered. No scandal language. No melodrama. No bait. The headline read, "County Retirement Banquet Raises Questions About Millbrook Attribution." Exactly right. Not family feud. Not daughter explodes. Not public meltdown. Questions about attribution. That is safer. Cleaner. More durable. By noon, the county had removed the Millbrook Legacy Board from the atrium, pending historical review. By the next day, the planning office requested the full redesign packet. By Friday, the banquet booklet had been pulled from the county archive draft and marked for revision before any formal retirement record could be stored. That was the aftershock I trusted most. "Paper moving," my mother called repeatedly. My father texted twice. "We need to talk before this gets bigger. The board is overreacting." Overreacting, as if decades of omission, one public denial, a false historical booklet, and a compromised archive were all still somehow smaller than the consequences of correcting them. I did not answer. Instead, I opened my project archive and built a clean file of everything tied to Millbrook. Original correction memo, revised calculations, invoice trail, county emails, review sequence, the banquet booklet page, photos of the atrium display, and the transcript of my father's banquet line as quoted in the article. That file changed something in me. Not because I wanted revenge, because it moved my life out of my family's language and back into my own custody. Marcus called the next evening. He said the county would likely revise the formal project history and possibly the retirement tribute materials as well. Then he paused and added, "That sentence should not have mattered as much as it did, but it came without softness, without pity, without the moral fog my family always used to keep me quiet. Just truth. You should have been named." My mother, meanwhile, left a voicemail that began with tears and ended with one sentence that told me she still understood nothing. "I just wish you had trusted us to handle this as a family." No, that was the whole point. I had trusted them for years, and as a family, was exactly how the erasure had survived. The most expensive aftershock, though, was private. Not anger. Not relief. Grief. Because once the room clears and the files move and the article prints and the county begins correcting itself, you are left with the part no institution can repair. The knowledge that the people closest to you would have let the lie become permanent if no one else had carried the packet into the room. That was the costliest truth of all. Not that my father lied once. That my family would have applauded the archive closed over my name. And once I understood that fully, the ending was no longer about the banquet. It was about what kind of woman I would be after it. 2 months later, the county issued a formal archival correction on Millbrook. No press conference, no ceremony, no dramatic statement of regret. Just a revised project record entered into the county infrastructure archive and attached to the digital summary. Critical structural redesign intervention completed through external review by Lena Mercer, P.E., prior to final state acceptance. It was a small sentence. It changed my life. Not because it healed anything, because it corrected the future. That is what expensive endings are built from, not emotional fantasy, but structural repair. The banquet had given me exposure. The archive gave me permanence. After the correction, the planning office invited me to review the revised Millbrook public summary before it was finalized. I read every line. I changed 2 phrases. I removed one sentence that still diluted the redesign sequence into a generic, adaptive collaboration frame. Then I signed off. That was the first time I had ever participated in my own history without needing permission from my father's version of it. The second expensive choice came a week later. Marcus Hale offered me a formal senior review role on a multi-county infrastructure package his firm had just won. Bigger scope, cleaner authority. My name would appear first on the technical review board list. 5 years earlier, I might have hesitated. Not because I lacked confidence, because I still believed visibility was somehow less honorable than being the unseen person who solved the hard part. I said yes immediately. That was the new woman. Not a daughter waiting to be named correctly. A professional who understood that naming matters. My father called after the county correction went live. His voice sounded thinner than it had at the banquet. Not broken, just reduced. That happens when public men discover that narrative control is not the same as truth. He said, "I should have handled Millbrook differently." It was the closest thing to a direct admission he had ever made in my life. I did not thank him for it. I said, "You should have said my name before the room needed a packet." Silence. Then, yes. That one word was enough. Not because it repaired the past. Because it removed the last excuse. My mother never managed that. She tried sentiment. She tried injury. She tried the family line about timing, tone, public embarrassment, and how retirement nights are emotional and people are imperfect. What she never said was the one word that would have mattered. Wrong. So I stopped trying to pull what she did not have out of her. That was another expensive ending choice. I gave up the fantasy of maternal clarity. Daniel came to my office once, 3 weeks later. Not home, not the family house. My office. That mattered. He stood in the doorway, looked at the drawings pinned to my wall, the certifications framed properly, the stacks of site packets, the order of a life that had nothing to do with my father's approval, and he said, "I think I let people assume things because I liked what it did for me." There it was. At last. Not confusion. Not innocence. Not, "I didn't know." Benefit. That was the first fully honest sentence he had ever given me. And because it was honest, I gave him one back. You didn't just let them assume, I said. You built your confidence inside those assumptions. He cried then, quietly, not performatively. And for the first time in our adult lives, I believed the tears were attached to understanding rather than self-protection. I did not absolve him. I did not need to. The most important ending came later. In a smaller room, I was reviewing a structural rehab memo with a younger engineer on my new project team when she asked, casually, "Do you want your name first on the final packet?" Old reflex rose immediately. The family reflex. The one that says, "It doesn't matter. Credit is small. Let the work speak. Don't make this about you." Then I felt the whole history of Millbrook move through me in one clean line. And I answered, "Yes, it matters." That was the expensive ending. Not the banquet. Not the correction. Not even the county archive. That sentence. Yes. Because at the end of this story, I did not become the daughter finally recognized. That is too small. I became the woman who stopped treating her own visibility as a moral compromise. The woman who understood that public credit, when attached to real work, is not vanity. It is protection. It is record. It is the difference between being useful in crisis and being erased in history. If there is a final lesson here, it is not that family truth wins if you are patient enough. It often doesn't. The real lesson is harder. If you keep allowing people to describe your work smaller than it is, one day they will describe your absence from the final picture as proof you never belonged there. And if that happens long enough, the room will believe them. Unless the packet arrives. Unless the witness stands. Unless you stop calling self-erasure professionalism. My father lost the ending he wanted. My mother lost the story she had polished. My brother lost the comfort of inherited legitimacy. What I lost was more valuable than all of that. I lost the old belief that competence alone would eventually make me visible. It doesn't. Not always. Sometimes the truth needs paper. Sometimes the paper needs a room. And sometimes, the room only changes when the woman at the center stops agreeing to stand in the margin. That night, I did not take my father's place. I took my name back from his version of history. And once I did, the archive followed. That was enough. That was expensive. That was mine.